During a seemingly mundane and uneventful day, the townsfolk were extremely bewildered when a sinkhole suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It swallowed a big portion of the road along with a couple of building structures. Sadly, there were 4 people in the buildings when they were taken, and they were never found again. Nobody knew why or how this gaping hole came to be, and the rumbles on the ground a few seconds prior to its appearance were also far from ordinary. Instead of a quake that vibrates the ground, the townsfolk felt a sudden jolt underneath. There was also some irregularities around the collapsed area. There was rubble on the surrounding floor as if they were withdrawn outwards. Instead of a cave-in, there was a great force that came from beneath the ground and broke out to the surface. These peculiar characteristics were only the beginning of this unprecedented phenomenon. Upon the sinkhole's unexpected appearance, this remote yet peaceful community was to experience a series of misery, agony, and hellish chaos within a single day. The local officers immediately came to the site even though they were also completely clueless about the matter. All they could do was to prevent panic and give assistance to those who needed it. They already asked some help from the neighboring cities, but it would take at least 2 days for anyone to reach them. The relatives of the victims who were swallowed by the hole begged for their aid, but even the officers were afraid to approach the void. Senior Officer Jack Rowe threw a rock inside the hole in order to estimate its depth, but the rock did not make a sound at all. The local miner Eddie Brown volunteered to climb down and search for any survivors. They strongly advised him not to do so, but he still insisted to proceed for the sake of the missing folks. Junior officers Thomas Reeve and Maggie Rain assisted his descent. Thomas held the rope on the surface, and Maggie handed a radio to Eddie so they could communicate. After reaching roughly 20 feet, they could no longer see the light on the miner's hard hat. Few minutes later, Thomas noticed that the rope was no longer moving. The radio started to fluctuate until it was completely shut off, and the last message they heard from Eddie was that his light could not reach the bottom of the hole. Thomas and Maggie tried to pull him up as fast as they could, but he was no longer on the other end. The officers remained posted around the sinkhole to keep an eye on it. The hole had grown a few inches since it appeared, and they feared that it would gradually get even bigger within each passing hour. They asked the townsfolk to stay away from it to make sure that there wouldn't be any more casualties. But these precautions were all for naught when the community was hit by another unprecedented misfortune. Roughly 4 hours after the sinkhole appeared, a number of townsfolk had fallen ill. Their bodies had suddenly grown weak as if their energies were sucked out of them. Some had difficulty breathing, while some were experiencing high fevers. Their bodies were aching all over, and a few of them were vomiting uncontrollably. Sadly, Officer Maggie was also one of the folks who got sick. Dr. Harris Attaway was the only physician of the town, and he couldn't possibly tend to all of the patients alone. They speculated that the symptoms could be an effect of high radiation, which might be coming from the hole. However, this theory did not explain what happened next. As the sun was setting, the residents who got sick suddenly showed some irrational and extreme behaviors. A 14-year-old boy named Kevin Taylor stayed on his mother's bedside when she got too weak to even stand. He kept on praying for her to get well, and he was very delighted when she abruptly sat up from her bed. He hugged her tightly as he asked what she was feeling, but her mother did not respond to his displays of affection. She had a blank look on her face, and she didn't even look at her own son, who was worried about her health. Dr. Harris also witnessed the same unexplainable behavior in his clinic. The patients who were wailing in pain a while ago had suddenly gone quiet with dead looks in their eyes. And when the sky went dark, their cold silence shifted into rage and violence. The concerned son Kevin kept his arms around his unresponsive mother's waist until she finally reacted to his embrace. However, her response was not what he expected at all. She wrapped her arm around Kevin's neck and locked his head against her shoulder. She aggressively pinned him down on the ground and pressed her knee over his abdomen. As Kevin was choking, she put all her weight on him and repeatedly tugged upwards until her son's neck was broken. Kevin died in the arms of his own mother, and she was no longer herself at that point. Meanwhile, violence was also spreading all over the town like a wildfire. In Dr. Harris's clinic, his patients ganged up on him and gouged his eyes out using his own equipment. They broke all his limbs and snapped his bones countless times until he died. This merciless method of killing was obviously uncalled for, and it was about to get even worse. Officer Jack and Thomas were running all over the place while houses were burning and people were being violently murdered from left to right. It appeared as if the people who fell ill were suddenly possessed. They were wreaking havoc and killing the residents in every way possible. Unfortunately, Thomas was killed in action when he came across Officer Maggie, who was shooting everyone she saw. Officer Jack gathered some of the helpless residents at the town's hall. He bolted the door and blocked all the windows to make sure that the perpetrators wouldn't be able to break in. However, they also ended up running for their lives when the hall was set on fire. Dead bodies were scattered on the streets. Jack was hearing screams wherever he went, but it was simply too much for one man to handle. As chaos unfolded upon the townsfolk, some of them heard a barely audible voice from the sinkhole. It was speaking in a language that they never heard before, and it sounded as if the words were overlapping each other as a single phrase. They were strange sounds that were impossible to reproduce, and the voices sounded so eerily domineering despite of not understanding a single word from it. Soon after they heard it, the people who seemed possessed had suddenly turned more aggressive. They gained an inhuman strength and speed, and they chased after the innocent folks like a pack of wolves with organized form of attacks. Officer Jack was doing his very best to protect the civilians, and he witnessed how the assailants defied gravity by running across the walls of the buildings and leaping off the ground to cover 2 yards in a single jump. They were panting and groaning like drugged beasts, overexerting their physical limits. Despite of receiving some gunshots, they steadily remained on their tail and were completely unfazed by the wounds. They tore off the limbs from their victims as if they were snapping off twigs, and they were jumping over their shoulders while grabbing their heads to slam them on the ground with enough force to completely shatter their skulls. Brains and pieces of bones were splattering all over, while the remaining survivors were screaming so desperately. They were simply too powerful and too fast to escape from, and they were finding all of them no matter where they tried to hide. Even though it was hard to fathom what was exactly going on, the officer recognized that the cause of all these horrors was the sinkhole. As an attempt to stop the bloodshed and save what little remained of the community, he mustered all his courage and went back to the hole. Armed with a shotgun, a couple of homemade Molotovs, and a hand grenade, he charged towards the assailants and burned them alive. However, their abnormal resilience from any physical damage kept them on their feet. As their flesh were set aflame, they kept on chasing after the officer who was running with everything he had. The only thing that kept them down was when their heads were blasted off with a shotgun point blank, but Jack was struggling to aim and reload while his enemies were coming from every side. With his strong resolve and refusal to give up, the officer managed to return to the sinkhole. But when he threw the hand grenade inside it, the possessed officer, Maggie Rain, just came out of nowhere and unhesitatingly leapt off into the void. The next thing he heard was the muffled sound of the explosion while her body was blasted back to the surface with a hole on her chest. She was able to catch the grenade and took all the damage in order to protect whatever was inside the hole. Jack fell on his knees and lost all hope while the possessed townfolk pinned him down to the ground. They held his head, arms, and legs, and then they simultaneously tore them off like a bunch of naughty kids decapitating a mere doll. When every single one of the townfolks were finally annihilated, they gathered their remains right next to the hole and piled them up. Few moments later, the mysterious instigators behind this horror finally climbed out of the void and revealed themselves to their loyal hounds. Humanoid entities with paper white skin and pitch black eyes levitated from the hole as the possessed townsfolk knelt before them with their heads down like servants to their gods. They presented the pile of dead bodies as an offering. These unnaturally pale and hairless giants stood at least 10 feet tall. They glided towards the mound of flesh like weightless beings riding the wind. One of them grabbed the decapitated head of Officer Jack Rowe. It opened its mouth wide from ear to ear and displayed its sharp, serrated teeth, and then it took a bite of the head. The skull was crushed and reduced to pieces under the strength of the pale humanoid's jaw, and it finished it off like a mere seedless fruit. Another one of them spoke to their servants with an incomprehensible language, but they seemed to understand what was being said. When the tall humanoid came across a badly injured possessed folk, it asked him to stand. Without hesitation, it drove its hand through his chest and ripped out its heart. Due to his injuries, the man was deemed unusable and was disposed of like a broken tool. A circular platform made of black, semi-translucent stone was elaborated carvings floated out of the sinkhole, and the human servants loaded their offerings on it like peasants hoarding their harvest. Once everything was loaded, they also rode the platform and descended into the void along with their masters. When the needed rescue finally arrived at the location, they were all quite perplexed when they didn't see a single person. There were puddles of blood and bits of flesh on the ground, but they did not find any dead body within the area. All that were left was the rubble of the destroyed structures. Oddly enough, even the reported sinkhole was nowhere to be seen.